Thanks, Kristen, and thanks to everybody for joining. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where everyone is. Thanks to all of you for joining us in a session that we, quite frankly, desperately wish we weren't having. This is first and foremost a humanitarian crisis, and we hope all of you, your colleagues, and your families are safe and healthy and will continue to be going forward. That being said, we'll cover a lot of ground on different content today, but we also have clearly well more than we could cover within 45 minutes. So just a brief overview of what we plan to discuss. We will spend a few minutes up front, and Linda and Sanjeev can give us an overview of just the overall situation. We'll be brief, but we want to make sure we set the stage appropriately. Then we'll spend a chunk of time really talking about what's the impact on the supply chains and the implications on our supply chain from the broader COVID-19 situation. And finally, we'll get into an overview of what are some of the things that you can do about it. And this will really cover across three different horizons, right? What are some of the things that some of the immediate actions to really manage through the crisis? What are some of the short to medium term things that people are seeing and some lessons learned from past crises on how to emerge successfully from the crisis? And then finally, once you emerge from the crisis, how do we think about setting up and designing the supply chain of the future that has the right level of resiliency given the world we're living in today? You will see that we have colleagues and speakers from across the globe, Asia, Europe, and North America represented here, really trying to bring a global view to this. And I think very naturally when we're talking about the impact and implications, a lot of the focus will be on Asia, just because there are more facts and learnings given where they are in the cycle. For some of us, that will involve us thinking about how will this play forward for us, and we'll get into what the potential implications could be for the U.S. and Europe. Obviously, with more than 600 participants, there will be many things here that are cross-industry. We've tried very hard to, have hard-hitting points in here. At the same time, everybody's context is different. I hope it goes without saying that we'd be more than happy to have individual sessions with any of you to talk about your specific situation, the learnings, and some of the lessons that can be applied to your context. And so just let us know. And we are, in this day, all working from home, and so we're on bated breath that technology does not fail us here, but if it does, we will do our best to be agile. So with that, thanks again for joining, and I'll pass over to Linda to walk us through some of the overall context.
Thank you so much, Dan. First of all, I want to make sure that we underscore that this is inherently very difficult. Predicting how anything will evolve with the virus and the pandemic nature, right? What was ultimately in the past tail risk and highly improbable has now become highly probable. And every scenario that we arrange has such a broad range of outcomes that I think it's important to underscore the breadth of all of this, right? The epidemiological situation has, you've probably seen this in the news, has ranged from a prevalence in the population from 1% affected by COVID-19 to 80% in an unmitigated situation. And so all of this is a function of the extent to which we understand how public health measures are imposed, how effective they are, how well followed they are. So let me just underscore that, which is one, the range of probability, and two, also indicate that while this is not, the macroeconomic scenario is not one-to-one tied to the clinical outcomes, so the case counts across the world, how the disease evolves and how institutions, economic corporations, individuals respond is very much a function of the perception of control of the disease. I think it is meaningfully important to just lay out a little bit of what we know about the context from an epidemiological situation today and how that has changed drastically in the last 2 weeks. And for that, I'd love to pass it to Sanjeev for a quick overview in terms of what that means, and then we can dive into the macroeconomic situation. Sanjeev?
Hi, happy to. Thanks. So I think just quickly, I'm going to start with a pretty significant high note in that much of what we're seeing in Asia, in particular China, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, has suggested that mitigation strategies, when coming from a place of pretty significant disease burden, can actually be effective. And so I think if that's where we start, then looking out to the rest of the world, I think there's some hope in terms of what will need to be done and how to go about doing it. If we start in the Middle East, I think there are just significant challenges with the health system and people's ability to access care in a timely manner, in addition to be able to provide diagnostics and appropriate therapeutic intervention. And so I think that's a lot of what we're seeing with what's happening in Iran. And most of the Middle East is, imposing travel restrictions that, one can anticipate would continue to progress as the situation worsens. I think of note in Europe, obviously there's a particular attention being paid to Italy, particularly in the north, where the healthcare system has become overburdened and significantly challenged. And I think there are a number of interventions that have taken place, but just realize that anything that's put into place today will take somewhere on the order of 10 to 14 days to realize benefits on the numbers that we're seeing on a day-to-day basis, given the incubation period of the virus. Outside of Italy, similarly, a number of interventions being taken earlier than they were taken in Italy. So presumptively, there should be an impact that we would expect to see. Now, I think one thing that is probably holding true between Europe and as we transition to the United States is that, I think while these interventions have been put into place, the challenge is that there's a delay in actually seeing the benefit from them. And so that may actually result in, regimes or governments or organizations acting in the interim to impose additional circumstances, whether that's regulatory or economic or with respect to travel and movement. And so as we see the case counts go up in both the United States and Europe over the ensuing days, where testing is ramping up aggressively, we also anticipate that there'll be some additional interventions put into place as a reaction to these counts, which ultimately should be able to drive down the impact of the virus over time. The question is how quickly and to what extent that we put them into place.
Yep.
Happy to hand it back to Linda.
Sanjeev. Thanks, Sanjeev. So, Sanjeev, thank you for that quick high-level thing. So a couple of things just to highlight based on what Sanjeev has said, right? The question of duration, the question of seasonality, the question of the real incidence rate, so really how much is it actually is in the population, are still very much TBDs, right? They're to be known and discovered. And the further along we go with how this epidemiology situation evolves, we'll get more clarity. But the first outset of this is still very uncertain. And to that extent, that's why we have widely divergent ideas in terms of how the macroeconomic situation could evolve. I'll lay out at a high level what we think in terms of just a broad span of two scenarios. And the reason why we think it's important to lay out both is the critical importance of understanding how your businesses, how your people, how your operations will be impacted under both scenarios, given the wide dispersion. In terms of just one, I'll lay out quickly in terms of the delayed recovery, right? We're already seeing China, East Asia starting to recover, but they will probably likely still have impact in terms of their supply chain and consumer confidence for much of Q2 2020. In Europe and in the U.S. right now, where the transmission complexes are spreading and in pockets of the U.S. in particular escalating, large-scale quarantines, travel restrictions, continued social distancing. Right? You'll see that still percolate through the environment through 2020, and we expect layoffs, corporate bankruptcies, with monetary easing having limited impact, right? But fiscal policy is still an unknown, and whether the adequacy of that will be a little bit misunderstood. And we're probably going to see completely a recession. I would say a sharp drop in terms of the global GDP growth, right? With recessions in the U.S. and also Europe, with slower growth in China and the rest of Asia. In the much more dire situation where we're looking at prolonged contraction, right? There is a world in which China and East Asia, they probably see a second wave of this in the winter if there's continued spread. Economic recovery could be derailed if that happens, and therefore pushed into first half of 2021. The U.S. and Europe will continue to see consumer confidence dampened, business spend down through the rest of 2020, right? And even if there's heterogeneous, which means that there's certain pockets of the U.S. or Europe that are deeply impacted, you'll expect them to be quite sharp, acutely impacted, right? And therefore, office-stretching financial system, potentially a full-scale banking crisis that would only be mitigated with significant macro-prudential supervision. Now, this situation is quite severe. It is unlikely that we would see full recovery until probably Q2, Q3 2021. But we wanted to lay out both of these scenarios, give you a sense of the wide dispersion in terms of how the situation could evolve from a macroeconomic perspective. I'll pass it back to, I believe, Dan at this point.
Great. Thanks, Linda. And now we'll dive into the supply chain implications, and Didier will start us off.
Thank you. So I'd like to cover what were the impacts in Asia, in particular in China. And as you know, the crisis started in January, end of January. We saw massive labor disruption in February and the beginning of March, and things are just starting to pick up. Basically, we see two different situations unfolding. One, which is outside of Wuhan and outside of the Hubei province, where about 65% of the workers have come back to work, and probably about 100% in the very large company. Inside Wuhan, there's probably 15 to 20% of the workforce that is back, but some are quarantined in large campus, probably for the next 2 weeks. Some, therefore, have not been allowed to go back into production. So when you look at all these numbers, you have to be really distinguishing between the people that are authorized to go back to work, people that are quarantined, and people that are actually allowed to produce. Our analysis is that in the Hubei province, probably no more than 10 to 15% of the labor force is back. But of course, this is changing rapidly, and especially this week and next week, a lot of authorization are being given so people can go back. Another part to consider is that, after such a long and massive shutdown, it may take 2 to 3 weeks to ramp up back production to your normal productivity level, things you had experienced before Chinese New Year. One thing we've noted is that a large number of workers, more than usual, due to the Chinese New Year break, have not come back to work. And companies have been paying, incentive and bonuses, especially to bring back migrant workers. Once the labor is back, I think the next bottleneck is parts of availability. Safety stock are going to be consumed within the next 2 to 3 weeks after you restart operation, unless there's replenishment taking place. And of course, those are going to be challenged by your supplier, tier 1, tier 2, starting, bringing back their labor as well. So daily, production prioritization and daily SNLP is required. And we advise companies to put that as part of their, crisis war room. Once you've gone through, the parts availability constraint, we believe logistic is a constraint coming up, but I will let Knut cover this later. If we could go to the next slide, which is the demand side of the equation. So obviously, we've seen a huge drop in demand. We've seen, 20% drop in retail, cars drop by 90%. And, consumer electronics phones down by 40%. But what we're seeing in the last 2 weeks is that there's an uptick in demand, in particular in computer sales and, internet products. And I think it's driven mostly by the work from home. Online sales have exploded as expected. And you see companies like, JD.com, Alibaba recruiting thousands of workers to fulfill demand. I think what we need to consider for Asia is that, beyond the demand within Asia, manufacturers here are really struggling to know what is the demand that's going to happen in Europe and the US. For many of them, the demand signal was not refreshed at all during the month of February. And it's only last week that they started to receive both from the, the US and European customer new forecasts. One of the questions is, if you had a backlog, is your backlog still accurate? Do you still need to produce this, or do you have new prioritization SKU that are required? So, given the current lockdown in US and in Europe, I think demand forecasting, refresh, demand sensing will be key for the weeks to come. And you should communicate to your Asia factories, on a daily basis through your demand war room, to make sure you don't have any bullwhip effects or, phantom demand, popping up at your factories. So that's it in a nutshell, and I'd like to pass it over to Knut to cover the logistic aspect of this crisis. Knut?
Thanks a lot, Didier. Let's look into logistics, and here I will basically talk about the different modes of transport. And as Didier said, it's very, very important that you have the logistics capacity as part of your of your daily war room sessions to understand what can be done, what should be planned for. So let me share some facts, and this is something that is kind of learning from China. And here we just have more data available, can clearly be applied also to Europe and to the US. So in ocean transportation, what we see is that we have in Q1 15% lower volume. We have also less cargo sailings, so 25% less cargo sailings, and we have a lot of empty containers. So 2 million containers are still idle or have been idle in February, and this even creates an imbalance that these containers are now missing in Europe and in the US. The good news is that logistics capacity is coming back. So also if we look into indices, the Baltic Dry Index, it's increasing, so it's getting back, but it's not yet back to normal. If we think about a comparison to other situations we had before, like the financial crisis in 2008, then back then we saw a 12% decrease in container capacity, and we had a significant time, 25 to 30 months, so 2.5 years for full recovery. And if you think about what that means, we clearly see that sea freight, ocean transportation will maintain operation. So that's very clear. We will see that the prices will increase. As Didier said, that currently we are living out of our safety stock. We are living out of our in-transit inventory. So when things start to get normal again, then there will be a demand, and this will be a kind of a capacity situation. We see that if you then think about Europe and US, so in Europe there is now a couple of manufacturers shutting down their plants, ramping down their plants. So that means that there will be volume declines in the short term, and in a couple of weeks again up. What we will see then to fill up the pipelines is not only sea freight, but also air freight. So maybe we can go to the next page where we cover air freight. The dried out supply chain basically needs speed, right? And speed for cargo means that we need to jump into air freight to recover and to make sure that we fill up volume. What we see here is that capacity significantly decreased, and that is because like 50 to 60% of the air freight capacity is anyhow belly capacity, so commercial flights where the belly capacity is used for cargo. And because commercial flights were canceled from to China, this capacity is gone, right? So here capacity is really down, and at the same time, clearly we see that prices significantly increase. If we again compare to the financial crisis situation, we see similar effects. So capacity decreased. Here we see even more capacity decrease, and it takes up to 2 years to recover. What we see, kind of, if companies now start to fill up stock, rates will increase, and unfortunately the available capacity will decline because we see more and more commercial flights being canceled because of travel bans. So here belly capacity will go down. First, airlines now started to operate commercial flights for cargo, so basically having no passengers but having only cargo, and with this make up for the need of capacity. We will see clearly spikes. So when we want to kind of go again back to normal to our to fill up our pipeline, we will see spikes. If you go to the next page, ground transportation, and this is kind of trucking capacity, but then also the ports. What we see is the trucking capacity went down to less than 20% in early February in China. This is now increasing, so we are at roughly 80% in China. And what we see here is even though trucking capacity is at 80%, there is still a challenge at the ports. So now everyone kind of goes to the ports. There is custom clearance and so on. So that is something that is affecting Chinese ports. What we see also happening in Europe and in US is that because of the shutdown of the countries and the restrictions, port operations might also go down a bit, right? So here the challenge is again to plan the capacity and make sure we look ahead. We take the demand into consideration and plan logistics. One other element is that e-commerce traffic significantly increased, and this requires not only a warehouse workforce, but then also last mile delivery and freight capacity. So that is something that is currently way over the capacity that exists, and companies are catching up and hiring people to make up. So with this, let me hand over to Ed to go more into the supply chain.
Thanks, Gabe. I'll cover briefly three things. First is what should companies be doing now to manage the crisis? Second is what should companies be thinking about over the next couple of months to both continue to sustain their crisis management, but also start to plan for ramp up and getting out of the crisis. And then third are longer term implications beyond the next couple of months. So right now we're looking at the 6 actions that we think companies and organizations should be doing now. These are somewhat interrelated. I'll talk briefly about each of them. First is creating transparency in your supply chain, particularly for multi-tier supply chains. We're seeing a range of successive companies in terms of right now collaborating with their tier 1 suppliers and getting visibility into tier 2, tier 3, and beyond. Yeah, obviously, supplier collaboration is a great way to get transparency and a place that everyone should start. We're also seeing companies in the crisis leverage different data sources, proprietary databases, open source data to start to get transparency beyond their tier 1s if they can't get it through their tier 1s. And even applying techniques like network analysis to data that they can collect to understand where are critical nodes, both for me and my industry, in the supply chain. And so, step one, we very much feel everyone should be pursuing right now is getting as much transparency as they can. So as the crisis continues to expand around the world into different regions, you have an idea of what in your supply chain is going to be affected. The second area is really understanding available inventory. And this might sound relatively straightforward, but connected with one of the other things that I'll talk about, which is Didier has mentioned, is changing consumer demand and business demand. The question of what available inventory is and how long it will last you is not a straightforward question and likely will be changing frequently. So really understanding what inventory do I currently have in transit, what inventory is in warehouses, what inventory might I have in spares stock that I could transition over to production stock if I need to. Having that picture built is something that, if isn't already done, should be done soon. On the third point around optimizing production and distribution capacity, obviously the priority number one is safety of workforces right now and how to get employees. So in order to protect them, many of us right now are reducing capacity and shutting down facilities where we need to. Understanding with the limited capacity that you still have, what products are most needed in the market, what are the highest value products to produce, and how do I optimize my production and distribution capacity to produce those is absolutely critical. And thinking about capacity not just within your own factories, but also capacity throughout the supply chain and orchestrating that production capacity for the products that you really feel are most critical right The fourth area, leveraging available logistics capacity, as Newt was talking about, the situation in every region of the world is rapidly changing in terms of the amount of capacity that is available, and making sure that you have regularly updated and near real-time understanding of what is going on with capacity throughout the network, and starting to, for high priority products that you prioritize in area number 3, is critical, and starting to book that logistics capacity now. The fifth area, and this will influence really almost every other area on this supply chain, is estimating realistic customer demand and business demand. This is not a straightforward challenge, as Linda and Sanjeev alluded to at the beginning of the discussion. The range of potential scenarios is wide, ranging from difficult to truly probably unprecedented in terms of a downturn through 2021, and starting to understand what would be the impact of each of those scenarios on demand, and flowing that back through sales and operations planning, and regularly updating those forecasts, not on a monthly basis, but probably on a more like weekly basis, or even potentially more frequently, is critical. And the sixth area is managing cash and net working capital for yourself and your supply chain. Obviously, supply chains can be a source of cash if you need it. Also, a number of your suppliers may be facing liquidity issues, either due to your own reduced demand or demand and reductions from other customers, and also their own capacity constraints as their labor force is affected by the crisis. And so really understanding, based on the first area of supply chain transparency, who is in your supply chain, and getting as much information as you can from them or outside end sources on their financial condition, and running stress tests of your supply chain over the next few days and weeks to understand in various scenarios, where will there be issues in my supply chain with liquidity and solvency, and how could I help critical suppliers manage through that, is something that we absolutely feel every company and organization needs to be thinking about. If you jump to the next page, we have seen, even before this crisis, but then the importance is accelerated in this crisis, many clients standing up digital control towers. And the idea of the digital control tower is essentially to aggregate as much data as you can related to the 6 areas that I just talked about into dashboards that update regularly. The overall problem to solve here is this crisis is evolving so quickly that getting data updates on a weekly or monthly basis is not frequent. You really need daily intelligence, and in some cases probably even more than daily and updates of intelligence and what's going on in your supply base, your logistics network, what's going on with consumers, plant shutdowns, etc. Finding a way to get that, and I think digital in this a crisis of this magnitude is probably the only way to get it frequently enough in a lot of cases, is absolutely critical. And if this is something that you don't have already, figuring out quickly with your teams how to actually aggregate data across the enterprise, bring in outside data sources where relevant, and integrate those into some sort of dashboard that's giving you more real-time visibility is absolutely critical. If we jump to the next page, I'll talk a little bit about what to think about over the next few months and then beyond, longer term. Obviously, this current disruption is probably the most significant disruption that we've seen in the past 10, 12 years since the financial crisis, and maybe even beyond from a supply chain perspective. That said, there have been many things over the past few years that have given us indicators that supply chains are getting more volatile. Trade wars, Brexit, changing trade relationships, tariffs, more intense weather events due to climate change, cyber attacks. It's just a litany of things that I think have made many of us say supply chains are getting more risky. And given that, we think this is really the time to, as we manage through this crisis and think about what do we do over the next few months and beyond, the time to potentially make some real changes. So obviously, in the next couple of months, making changes and incremental tweaks to continuously improve material supply stability is critical. So using the data that we just talked about, using the real-time intelligence that you're getting, to think about, are there alternative suppliers I can bring online? Are there tools that I can provide my organizations and my suppliers to help manage bullwhip effects and whiplash effects? Are there other things that I can do over the next couple of months that will really help stabilize the situation today and take immediate risk out of the supply chain? Especially if I think about some of the more pessimistic scenarios that Linda was talking about, where even if we see maybe a recovery in certain parts of the world, potentially a double dip in terms of the spread of the disease later in the year, how do I make sure that I'm ready for that? And then as we get past the next few weeks and you start to feel that the crisis is, though maybe still ongoing, at least understood, and you've got the management around it, really kicking off an effort to say, how do I get more resilient, both to make sure I manage out of this crisis, but then also given all the uncertainty in the world, and given the fact that it feels like we're in a world where there's just more volatility in supply chains, what can I actually do to fully understand where the vulnerabilities in my supply chain sit? How do I take a holistic look at that across my supply network, my logistics network, my financial stability, how I'm designing my products, and really design a more resilient supply chain in the future, given all the different types of disruptions I might face? And also in this crisis, but also beyond, is this an opportunity to build more collaborative relationships with all the other people in my ecosystem that have an influence over my business, regulators, other partners, investors, et cetera. And so that's, as we think about the medium term, the next couple of months, but also beyond longer term, that's what we're starting to think about, and think that even though it probably feels like right now it's all about the crisis, in the next few weeks, it's probably important to start thinking about some of these things, because the opportunity to really make some changes might be now. And with that, I'll pass it on to Christian to kick off our Q&A.
Thank you, Ed. We've had a few questions come in. One says, what are we seeing in demand in terms of consumer electronics, and specifically the uptick in demand for technology? Is it being driven by work from home in China? Can the group comment on that?
Sure, I'll take it. So obviously the near-term impacts are definitely from the work from home and the necessary need to connect and keep the economy going and keeping companies going. What we're also seeing is folks really starting to accelerate now, thinking about how do they operate in this new norm with technology, but also the telcos as well, and how do we take advantage of 5G, the new technology coming on board. That's the first trend. The second trend we're also seeing is folks now accelerating their plans towards automation, right? This is somewhat a bit of a wake-up call around how do we think about workforce, how do we think about supply chain sustainability, and how do we remove some of the manual interventions in the supply chain today. So we would see that a bit of a shift from computers and electronics that are about connecting the workforce. We see that probably continuing, and then also more into the infrastructure and technology around how do we accelerate more of the automation across the supply chain. Again, just an outlook, what we're seeing, I can't state that for certain, but definitely we're seeing a lot more conversations happening in those areas.
There's a few questions coming up about U.S. port shutdowns and what we expect to happen there. Knut, can you comment at all about availability and unload times and potential for shutdown?
Yes, let me take this. So if we think about what happened in China and see this as a proxy for U.S. and also for Europe, is that we clearly see labor shortage in the ports, right? Because people were quarantined and in tracking capacity during February. And this basically led to long waiting times in front of the ports. So we hear from 5 to 10 days waiting time to get the stuff handled in the ports. So that is something that might happen in the next weeks. At the same time, governments, I know that for Europe, are working on making sure that we ensure workforce is up, and even repurpose or kind of have people that are formerly working, for example, in retail, as retail now is completely shut down, to have them working in other areas, right, and to help out, and with this making sure that we keep the capacity up. Capacity itself or capacity requirement will go down as we clearly see production going down. So, but this lower capacity we clearly need to do.
We had several questions come in about the food and beverage supply chain. Any commentary on how you're seeing that evolve and specific concerns that you'd have?
Yeah, maybe I can start, and Kurt, you can jump in if anything else. I think a few things. The food and beverage is an interesting one because certainly in the U.S. And I think similar in other parts of the world, you know, you're seeing a surge in demand as people prepare. And we saw this in Italy. You've seeing it now in the U.S. over the last week to 10 days, a massive surge in demand for as people stock their pantries and as people really prepare for potentially, you know, long periods of time at home. A couple things that are very, very relevant there is I think a lot of companies are trying to figure out what portion of the demand is people stocking the shelves versus what portion of the demand is actually increased consumption. As the likelihood of longer and longer time at home potentially increases, I think, you know, there's more and more certainty that a good portion of the demand is actually, you know, real and kind of consumption based. The second thing is, you know, kind of an overwhelming tax on the supply chain, whether it starts from the manufacturing facilities, logistics, et cetera. And really within the four walls, you see a couple things happening. One is just the surge in demand that's completely unexpected and the ability to ramp up or down. And it's combined with a time when almost all, you know, so many schools across the country are shutting down, and the real concern about the ability, you know, people have to maintain childcare. So there's absenteeism is going, you know, up meaningfully, not to mention if, you know, the virus actually starts showing up in manufacturing facilities, what the implications would be on the ability to just continue to run the food supply chain and the beverage supply chain. I think the piece that is, you know, I don't know if good news is the right word, is that we do see some people taking relatively drastic actions that are, you know, thoughtful, right? I've seen a company cut and say they're cutting 80% of their SKUs in the short term to just be able to manage maximizing the output. And so you might not have the flavor variety you want or the size you want, but you can get a product, and they're going to focus on that. And so I think as companies see, you know, this playing out is not just a short-term blip, I think there will be more and more drastic actions that people are taking in order to ensure that they're, you know, keeping the food supply chain as real as possible. And then the obvious, you know, upstream impact starts to be questioned of if people are getting packaging in from overseas, et cetera. What are the potential risks there? But, you know, for now, I think people are very focused on making sure that there is the subset of products that we need, or the core set of SKUs, and keeping the facilities running and keeping the bases moving. So I think it's evolving very drastically, but clearly one where I think there is some advantage in terms of the loading that's happened of, you know, kind of taking up some of the excess capacity that some of the manufacturing facilities have.
Yeah, let me just add a couple points there just to build on what Dan said, right? There's definitely a shift in food and beverage from away from home to at home. So as we think about, you know, restaurants shutting, how do we restock our pantries at home and folks eating more at home? So as your shift in demand from food service to retail, there's a huge shift going on there. And then also there's a number of different shifts that are happening where there's food in the supply chain today, whether it's at the cruise lines, and you can hear about all the avocados in the cruise lines, and how do you get those back into the supply chain where it's needed, right? So you see this channel shifting going on, I think, is the first part. The second part is we are just at the beginning of the growing season, right? We don't see the impacts just yet. So I think the growing season still looks pretty healthy. Third thing is on retailers. Dan talked about it, right? Necking down the SKUs and SKU portfolio to A items to make sure that those items are moving quickly off the shelf. And then the third thing, or the fourth thing we're seeing is really around in-plant. Right now, we haven't seen a lot of plants shut down, but they're starting to think about operating differently, whether that's different shifts going to 24/7, slowing down the throughput so you don't have as many people in the plants, or for that surge capacity. We're seeing a lot of folks in the food and beverage industry rethink their labor strategy given the constrained nature and the shuttering of cities across the world.
Thanks, Kurt. Next question. You mentioned SNLP a couple of times. Could you expand on how critical you think this is for crisis management? Should this be an important element of crisis management teams?
I can comment on this. This is Knut. SNLP is super critical. If you think about what SNLP in essence is, it's bringing people along the value chain together. So you cover end to end. You have transparency. You ideally have also scenario modeling capabilities, and with this you can decide, right? You kind of understand the financial impact of your decisions, and this is exactly what we need to do now. We don't do it on a monthly basis. We in a war room we decide on a daily basis, but at the end we want to also understand what's the implication of it. And what we see is that clients who did implement an end-to-end SNLP process, who have the right transparency set up, who have the right scenario modeling capabilities, are much ahead in operating the war rooms, because this is exactly the process we leverage. Just one comment on what will happen in the future. SNLP currently is, depending on industry, done on a monthly basis or weekly basis or quarterly basis. What we will see is that the frequency will increase, right? Because people will see in this crisis that this is a huge benefit to take business decisions. So the frequency will increase, and people are much more kind of into the details and know what to do.
As companies broaden their supply chain, is there a safe haven that you will recover sooner or be immune from the virus? How should we think about alternative suppliers, especially as more regions become affected by COVID-19?
This is Ed. I can start with this one, and then others, please feel free to jump in. I don't think at this point it's prudent to speculate on safe havens. We've seen the recovery, as Didier mentioned, in Asia, but as Linda mentioned when talking about the epidemiological and economic scenarios, it's not assured that Asia is fully out of the woods, or East Asia is fully out of the woods. I wouldn't, at this point, try to start placing bets on areas that will be immune to the virus or won't experience a second surge in infection. I think what is important is really understanding what is your positioning today. Are you, once you have transparency into your supply chain, are you concentrated in certain geographies? And if you are there things that you can do both immediately in the crisis to diversify supply, but maybe even looking ahead to 6 months from now, where hopefully we don't have this happen, but if we were to have a second round of infection outbreak, can I be more resilient for that very unfortunate and painful scenario? So I wouldn't think about it so much as looking for safe havens that are going to be immune to the impact, but more thinking about what can I do today, and then preparing for potentially a second round of outbreak if that were to happen, to be more resilient.
Thanks, Ed. We have several questions. Sorry, go ahead.
If I may add, we see companies, looking at the process to qualify supplier and whether there's a way to speed that up. We'll see also companies that, require tooling, investing maybe in buying extra tooling just as an insurance risk against, their supplier, being in difficulty. So we see a lot of that happening right now.
we've had several questions about the pharma supply chain. Can the panelists speak about what trends you're seeing there?
Yeah, so a couple different dimensions on the pharmaceutical supply chains, right? For drugs and drug manufacturers, shifting production dynamically across the network to fulfill the needs is happening. It's ongoing, looking to qualify alternative suppliers as well at this point. So that's the first piece on the pharma industry. Second, on med devices, right? If you see the press and look at what the data is coming out from the World Health Organization, CDC, right? There is a massive shortage in PPE, personal protection and equipment, as well as ventilators. And so folks in the med tech world are, one, thinking about and moving product across different industries. So the construction industry has been asked to move some of their masks and protective equipment into the hospital supply chain. And then also the ventilator industry is obviously ramping up, qualifying new suppliers and moving through quickly. The FDA is intimately involved in trying to help ease some of the regulations and qualifications, moving things quite quickly through the supply chain. And then we also see some others, right, whether it's LVMH in France, switch over from making perfumes to hand sanitizer, or some of the distilleries to move over from distilling spirits into hand sanitizer. We see that that's going to happen more and more as we go through this crisis and truly understand where the shortages are in our health systems globally.
Can we make a comment on e-commerce? There are several questions about if we think that the shift to online buying is here to stay after this crisis, or if we expect it to be a one-time shift.
Yeah, I'm happy to say a couple things there. One is, obviously, the kind of shift towards e-commerce was a long-standing trend, kind of before the crisis. I think we clearly will see a meaningful jump, and have seen in Asia a meaningful jump in e-commerce. And I think the question there is, if you look back at some of the past crises, some of this consumer behavior has returned to normal, and other has shifted to the new normal. And what the driver of that is, quite frankly, the experience that consumers have when they're, driving a lot more through e-commerce. As we look, pre-crisis, oftentimes the satisfaction with e-commerce is actually quite high, and the people that use e-commerce are often using it repeatedly. So I think there's a widespread belief that as more and more people are trying e-commerce and trying buying new products through online, that this will lead to a substantive shift in what that looks like going forward. So, impossible to predict, but I think if you made us put a bet on this one, there's a strong likelihood that this will accelerate and potentially be a step change in the e-commerce purchasing habits from what was already a pretty meaningful trend over time.
And with that, Dan, I'll hand it over to you to close us out.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen, and thanks again to everyone for joining. Hopefully we took something away from this. As we mentioned, obviously when we're covering this for, 600 plus attendees, it's not as tailored as we'd like it to be. And as I mentioned at the beginning, please don't hesitate to reach out, and we can schedule a specific conversation. And there were 50 to 60 plus questions that we were not able to answer here. And so we'd be more than happy to take the opportunity to dive into your specific context and specific questions. Please just let us know. But the other thing I would emphasize is that part of our ability to help move society forward, help companies move forward, are the insights and best practices. We're certainly learning. I think we're all learning as we're going through this every day. And so please also reach out with suggestions, comments, etc. I think we're all ears, and we certainly feel that we're all in this together. And I guess I will end where I started. You know, this is a humanitarian crisis, and please, everyone be healthy, be safe, and, you know, sending nothing but our absolute best wishes to you, your colleagues, and your families going forward. So thank you again for joining today, and hope everyone has a great day.